Hi, and welcome to the demo video for QOOBIT Project Config plugin for Unreal Engine. To get started, we just go to the Edit menu and we go to the plugins and ensure that our Project Config plugin is in fact enabled. So if you can't find it, it should be under the code plugins, or you can do a search for Project Config and it should show up in the list here. So make sure it's checked. And if it's not checked, you may need to restart the editor to make sure that the plugin is enabled. So once the plugin is enabled, we go to Edit and we go to our project settings. And if you scroll down to the bottom under our category of QOOBIT, you'll see a new setting called Project Config. Underneath here, you'll see that we have 3 new fields now. And you can see that it's actually stored under default Q project config.ini. So where this lives is underneath the config folder where your thing lies. So for example, this is our project folder, and we go to our config here, and this is going to be where that config ini is being saved. So from here, we can now enter in our new configs. So we have, for this demo, we're just going to enter in project code ABC as a test. And for our Python environment directory, for this demo, we're just going to do some other paths just to show how flexible the system can be. So we're just going to call this another Python path. And we're also going to do another semicolon, and we're going to do D drive as another example. For this next part of this demo, we're going to leave this blank for now, and we'll come back to this field later. So for now, we just set the project code, and we set 3 separate Python environment directories. Note that one we have relative, and one absolute path here. As you can see at the top here, when we ever make any changes to these fields, it is important to restart the editors for the values to take effect. So what we're going to do is we're just going to close this project, and we're just going to start it up again once more. And now that we're back here, we can switch our console mode to Python, and we can bring up our output log just to make sure that we actually have the correct Python setup. When we do set up the project correctly and the plugin is working as intended, you'll see that in the output log, it will display out our config settings. You can see that we have the project code initialized here, and we have our multiple resolved Python paths. So you can see here that we have this Python path, which is actually the relative that got resolved to the absolute Python path. We have our another Python path, which is one directory down from our path here. And we also have our absolute path D drive here as an optional thing. So to make sure that that's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, we can do an import sys, and then we can just print out sys.path. All right. And we can see, we scroll to the tail end of it, we'll see that we have our absolute path here, our second, another Python path, and our standard Python path. So you can see here that we can do both relative and absolute Python paths. And where is this helpful is that normally if you're working with Python, and if you're familiar with the plugin, you can add additional paths here under the original Python plugin. However, the paths here can only support absolute paths. So with this setup, you can actually bring in config paths that are relative, so that when you're using something like Perforce or other forms of version control, and you need to have relatively sourced Python directories, you don't have it set as a hard-coded absolute path. So everyone could have a different folder that is relative to their project directory. So this is, I've seen a lot of people have this question on the forums, and also other clients we've worked with had this requirement. So this is actually a pretty useful feature to have on top of the standard Python paths that's built in. The next feature we want to cover is the data source folder. So if you guys are not aware, if you go into our editor preferences and you type in a search for data source, there is this data source folder feature here. So by default, it's actually blank, but note that because this is an editor preference, this is actually set for every instance across every project in Unreal Editor. So that means if you have a project here and another game there and another project there, everyone is going to be using this value once it's been set. So this is not very useful in the sense that if you have different projects that need different data source folders, you cannot arbitrarily set and designate a data source folder for each project. To solve this, we have our own per project data source folder override here. So before we fill this field within anything, we'll kind of show you why and what the data source folder actually is. So coming down to here as an example, we're just going to go to the demo folder here. We have here prepped a PNG file. That's a sample here. And we're just going to drag this in. You can see that it's under d/demo. And we drop it in here. And you can see that in the metadata at the bottom here, it says source file. And it has the absolute path there, demo icon 128. And where this is not very helpful is that if we push this to our version control and another person grabs this file, they cannot use the right-click re-import feature unless the image file is in the exact same folder location. So I may have a D drive here, but someone else working on the project may not have D drive, and they would not be able to re-import this file. So their only option that they're left with is using re-import with new file, and they would have to look for a new path, which isn't all too helpful. So to get around this, we want to leverage this data source folder that is in the editor preferences. But like we mentioned before, we don't want to have it always be the same value. We want it to be scoped on a per project basis. So in order to do this, as an example, we're going to do d:/ as an example here, and we're just going to restart the editor just for these changes to take effect. And now that we're back in the editor, we're just going to open up our project settings once more just to make sure the settings have been saved. You can see that we are using D drive as the data source folder now. And then we can see that if we go to our editor preferences and we type in data source now, it's actually scoped to D drive now because we set it here, and on startup, it's going to copy this value and it's going to paste it into this field at the start. So what we can do now is we can actually take this, and let's say we do a re-import now. You'll see that the data is no longer using an absolute path. It's using a relative path for the source file. You can see that it's just under demo/icon 128. So where this is going to be helpful is rather than using an absolute path for this data source folder, you can do something like source assets, right? So what we can do here now is if we go into our project folder here and we go right beside our project folder, we create a new folder called source assets. We can now put all our source assets in here in a relative location to our project directory. So if we imported our PNG image, which we'll do, I guess we'll do another example here. We're just going to copy this into here. And then if we imported it from this location now after we restart the editor, it will be relative to the project root. And where this is helpful is if you're working in a team, everyone's going to be able to get access to the same source files. So just as a best practice, we generally don't want to put these PNG files or FBX files inside of the content folder here. The reason being is that whatever you put in here that's not a U asset or a U map, you're not going to see in Content Browser. So generally, you want to keep your source assets outside here. So maybe somewhere here, or maybe even one level up here, just outside of your project folder here. So as best practices, yeah, just keep your source files and your source assets in a project relative location. And when you're using this feature, all your team members can usually just come in here and just hit re-import, and they don't need to worry about repathing all their files back and forth. So this is the second feature that we added here, which is going to be our project editor data source folder. And that is going to override this value here every time you restart. And our third and final feature is going to be very simple, is just being able to access a project code identifier here. So we specifically call it project code because this can be user defined. So if you go to the start of the project settings here, it should be all settings, you can see that there is in fact a unique project ID, but this is a generated UUID that you may or may not want to use, and it may be something that you do want to use, but you also want another project identifier. This is where the project code can be helpful. So if you go down to here, we have our project code, and if we have ABC here, we can also use it in the scope of widgets and other tools that you may use. So for example, here, we just added a big full screen button, and we tied it to our get project code. and we can print the string out of the project code. So if you want to access any of our other custom config variables, you can also go down to the QOOBIT category here, and you'll see we have project config code, data source folder, and the Python environment directory. So you can get directly access to the config fields for other purposes should you ever need to. So from here, just an example, we can load this widget, and we can hit the button and you can see that it's printing out ABC. So you can use this for other purposes like custom pathing or any other fields you would need this for. And hopefully this helps you guys get around some of the features that aren't natively available to Unreal Engine. So that's it. And hopefully this plugin will help you guys get more things done. Thanks.